No one came to greet the bride until a cowboy's daughter asked, "Are you the angel Mama sent?" Dawson's Crossing, New Mexico Territory, spring of 1869. Emily's knees weakened. For a moment, she thought the ground itself had given way beneath her. Her breath came in shallow bursts, as though every word the man had spoken had stolen the air from her chest. Henry gone. The promise of spring, the apple blossoms, the home she had dreamed of, all gone with him. The man, Henry's brother, folded the letter with care and held it in his work-worn hands. His jaw tightened, but grief clouded his eyes. "I buried him myself," he said quietly, "on the ridge above the ranch. He deserved better." Clara looked between them, her small face puzzled. "Papa?" she said softly, tugging at his sleeve. "Is she still an angel?" The man glanced down at his daughter. His lips pressed together, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, his gaze lifted back to Emily. Something unreadable lingered there. A mixture of sorrow, apology, and something else she couldn't quite name. Emily clutched her satchel tighter. "I shouldn't have come," she whispered. "I didn't know. I thought—" Her voice broke, and she turned as if to leave, though her legs wavered beneath her. "Wait," the man said suddenly. His voice wasn't commanding, but it carried a weight that stilled her steps. She turned back slowly. He cleared his throat. "My name's Daniel Carter. I reckon you deserve to know that much." Henry spoke often of a woman he admired, said she was brave, said she made him feel human again. His voice faltered. "I didn't think he'd meant it so deeply." Emily blinked hard, forcing back tears. The image of Henry's crooked smile, the way he had spoken of his family, pressed sharp against her heart. "He wanted me here," she whispered, almost to herself. Clara slipped her small hand into Emily's, looking up with wide eyes. "Then maybe Mama and Uncle Henry both sent you," she said with the certainty only a child could hold. Daniel exhaled slowly, shoulders heavy with a grief he clearly carried alone. "You've come a long way, Miss Carter. No sense in turning back tonight. There's supper on the stove. You can rest here if you've a mind to." Emily hesitated. Every part of her wanted to collapse, to give in to the weight pressing against her chest. Yet the warmth of Clara's hand and the quiet steadiness of Daniel's voice rooted her in place. She nodded faintly. "Thank you." And so, Emily Carter crossed the worn threshold of the Carter homestead. Not as a bride, not as the woman Henry had promised, but as a stranger stepping into the fragile heart of a broken family. She did not know it yet, but this first night, filled with silence, shadows, and the faint smell of wood smoke, would be the beginning of a story she had never dared to imagine. The Carter home was modest, rough-hewn beams, floors worn smooth by years of boots and bare feet. The table was scarred but sturdy. A single lamp burned low, filling the room with golden shadows. Emily sat across from Daniel. Clara perched beside her with a tin cup of milk clutched in both hands. The smell of stew filled the air, beans, onions, and salted pork. Emily lifted her spoon, though her appetite had vanished somewhere between the station and the truth. Still, she forced a small bite. The warmth of it steadied her, if only a little. Clara broke the silence first. "Papa makes stew when he's sad," she said simply. Daniel's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. His jaw tightened, but he didn't correct her. Emily set her spoon down gently. "It's good," she said softly. "Reminds me of my father's cooking, when he was alive." Daniel's eyes flicked to hers, searching, measuring. Then, with a quiet nod, he returned to his meal. The empty chair. When the bowls were cleared, Emily noticed the chair at the end of the table, slightly pulled out, as if someone had always sat there but hadn't for some time. A cup rested upside down near its place. Clara followed her gaze. "That was Mama's chair," she whispered. "Papa leaves it there so she doesn't feel forgotten." Emily swallowed, her throat thick. She reached across and squeezed the girl's small hand. Daniel caught the gesture, his face unreadable, but his shoulders seemed to ease ever so slightly. The offer. Later, as Clara was put to bed, Daniel stood on the porch, lantern in hand. The night stretched wide and star-filled, coyotes yipping in the distance. Emily stepped out, pulling her shawl tight. "You don't owe me kindness," she said quietly. "I can find a room in town tomorrow. I won't trouble you." Daniel studied the horizon, the lantern light casting deep lines across his weathered face. "Town's no place for a woman alone," he said. "Not these days. You'll stay here, at least until you know where you're bound." Emily's eyes stung. "I had thought I knew," she whispered. He looked at her then, really looked, past the dress faded from travel, past the sorrow written in her eyes. Something softened in his expression. "You came for my brother," he said. "But maybe you're meant for something else." The silence stretched, heavy but not cold. Emily clutched her shawl tighter, unsure if she wanted to weep or to hope. The first night. That night, Emily lay on a narrow bed in the spare room, her satchel tucked close. She unfolded Henry's letter once more, tracing the words with trembling fingers. But instead of only pain, Clara's voice echoed in her memory. "Mama said she'd send an angel when it got lonely." Emily closed her eyes. For the first time since stepping off the train, she prayed. Not for Henry, not for herself, but for the little girl who believed she had been sent. And in the room next door, Daniel sat awake by the dying fire, the letter on the table before him. His hand rested on it, as though to guard it, though his eyes were fixed on the shadows. He had buried his brother. He had buried his wife. But now, in his home, slept a woman who might be both a reminder of loss and the beginning of something unasked for, yet needed. The fire popped softly. Daniel exhaled. The weight of silence felt different tonight. The days folded into one another, marked not by grand events but by small, steady rhythms. Emily found her place in the kitchen, her hands kneading dough as naturally as they once stitched hems. Clara followed her everywhere, tugging at her skirts, asking questions, laughing at flour smudged across Emily's cheek. Daniel noticed the sound of that laughter, how it filled corners of the cabin that had sat silent for too long. At night, after Clara had gone to bed, the house would quiet. Daniel would sit by the fire, sharpening his tools, and Emily would mend a shirt or write a line or two in her notebook. They didn't speak much, but the silence had shifted. It no longer pressed down like a weight. It held them, soft as a quilt, steady as the crackling fire. One evening, Daniel glanced at her as the lamplight softened her face. "You miss home?" he asked, voice low. Emily paused, needle mid-stitch. "I miss what I thought it might be. But no, not the place itself." He nodded, understanding more than his words could show. "Sometimes I think the land takes more than it gives." But then, he looked toward the bedroom door, where Clara's breathing could be heard in her sleep. "Then I remember what it leaves you with." Emily followed his gaze, her throat tightening. She said nothing, but her hand stilled, resting lightly against the fabric. The days grew colder, frost silvering the grass each morning. Clara's cheeks stayed red from the chill, her mittens always damp from snow. Emily would bring her inside, peel off the layers, and set her by the fire with a cup of warm milk. Daniel would come in from the fields, his shoulders dusted with frost, and for a fleeting moment, the cabin felt less like survival and more like home. One Sunday, as they walked back from town, a rider passed them fast on the road, glancing back with a smirk. Emily stiffened. She recognized the look. It was the same one she'd endured all her life, weighing her, measuring, dismissing. She turned her face away, but Daniel had seen. His jaw tightened, and his hand shifted on the reins. "They don't matter," Emily whispered, almost to herself. Daniel looked at her, really looked, his eyes dark as the sky before snow. "They won't matter here. Not to me. Not to her." His head tilted toward Clara, skipping in the dust ahead. Something inside Emily eased, just a fraction. Enough for her to draw a deeper breath, enough for her shoulders to loosen. Winter deepened, wrapping the valley in silence. The nights grew long, and the roof creaked under the weight of snow. Emily rose earlier now, stoking the fire before dawn, her breath clouding in the cold as she moved through the cabin. Daniel noticed, though he rarely said anything. Instead, he left kindling stacked higher by the door, and once, when she came in from hauling water, she found her boots sitting by the fire already warmed. Clara, restless with the season, made her own games indoors. She built little towns from wooden blocks, lining them neatly across the floor, then toppled them over with loud crashes. Emily laughed, even when the pieces scattered underfoot. Sometimes Clara would curl up beside her with questions. Do angels eat supper like us? Or when Mama was here, did she smile like you do? Emily never had easy answers. She would smooth Clara's hair, and the child seemed content enough with silence. Daniel, too, seemed to soften in small ways. He brought her books once, borrowed from the preacher's wife in town. He didn't say much, only set them on the table, his hands rough from cold and work. Emily traced the worn covers, surprised by the thoughtfulness. Another time, when she pricked her finger on a needle, he reached without hesitation, took her hand, and wrapped it gently in cloth. He didn't let go right away, but not everything was gentle. Supplies ran thin. One morning, Daniel rode into town for flour and returned tight-jawed, his knuckles white on the reins. Emily asked no questions until Clara had gone to bed. Then, by the fire, she spoke quietly. Something happened. Daniel's eyes stayed on the flames. Storekeep won't give credit. Says I still owe from last winter. Truth is, I do. Emily waited, the crackle of the logs filling the silence. He leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. Henry used to handle these things. Always had a way with words, with people. Don't. They look at me and see trouble, same as always. A man who can't pay his debts. Emily set aside her mending, her hands folding in her lap. That isn't what I see. Daniel turned to her then, searching her face as if trying to believe it. His voice softened. And what do you see? She swallowed, her heart unsteady. A man still standing, when lesser men would have walked away. A father who doesn't let his daughter go cold. A brother Henry trusted. The silence stretched, thick and fragile. Daniel's breath left him slow, as though her words had pulled something loose inside. Snow fell harder that night, the roof sighing beneath its weight. Emily lay awake, listening to the storm, her hand brushing against the folded letter still tucked in her satchel. Henry's words had brought her here, but it was Daniel's presence that steadied her now. Her hands shook as she yanked open the drawer where Henry's revolver rested, wrapped in a faded cloth. She had never fired a gun in her life, not truly, but Henry had once placed it in her palms, told her it wasn't just a weapon, it was a promise. Protect who you love. Protect what matters. The weight of the Colt was heavier than she remembered. She stepped back outside, the roar of fire lighting the yard like hell itself. James was on the ground, a boot pressing into his shoulder, the rifle raised high. Emily raised the gun, both hands trembling. Let him go. Her voice cracked, but it cut through the chaos. The man with the torch sneered. Or what? You'll miss and hit your husband instead. I'm not his wife, Emily shot back, her voice steadying. But I'll be the last thing you ever see if you don't move. For a moment, everything froze. The fire, the wind, even James's ragged breath. The Colt gleamed in the firelight, pointed straight at the man's chest. The rifle lowered just a fraction. The man holding James cursed under his breath. Collins won't like this. Emily's finger brushed the trigger. Neither will God. Something in her eyes made them falter. A choice was made. The man shoved James roughly into the dirt, then spat. This isn't over. You'll wish you had sold. They backed away, slipping into the smoke and disappearing into the night. Emily dropped the Colt only when James pulled it gently from her hands. She hadn't realized she was still shaking. He looked at her, soot across his face, a cut bleeding near his brow, but his eyes burned with something more than gratitude. You just saved my life, he said hoarsely. Emily swallowed hard, her voice breaking. I wasn't going to let them take you, too. For the first time, James reached out, not as protector or guardian, but as a man reaching for the only anchor he had left. His hand closed over hers, rough and trembling. The fire still raged behind them, but in that moment, the world narrowed to two people standing in the ashes, bound by more than survival. And in the glow of the burning shed, something unspoken finally took root. Her hands shook as she lifted the revolver from the mantel. It was heavier than she remembered, heavier than her courage felt. For a heartbeat, she froze. The weight of killing, the memory of Henry's handwriting in her apron pocket. Love is the only thing worth carrying into battle. But love now meant survival. Emily stepped out onto the porch, the Colt steady in her grip though her pulse thundered. The man with the rifle swung again, ready to finish James. Emily fired. The crack split the night. The man screamed, dropping his weapon, clutching his shoulder. The other spun, stunned by the shot and the sight of the quiet governess standing tall, smoke rising from the barrel. "Get away from him," Emily said, voice low but unyielding. One of the men snarled and lunged toward her, but James, fueled by rage and raw will, surged to his feet and tackled him. They crashed into the dirt, fists flying. The third man hesitated, torn between fight and flight, until Emily cocked the hammer back again. "Try me," she warned, steel in her tone. The man cursed and bolted into the night, dragging his wounded companion with him. The last fought James until his nose broke under a well-aimed blow. Staggering, bloody, he stumbled back, spitting into the dirt before retreating after the others. Silence fell, save for the crackle of the dying fire and the ragged sound of breath. James stood bent, bruised, his shirt torn, blood streaked across his temple. Emily lowered the gun slowly, her arms trembling now that the danger had passed. He looked at her, eyes wide, not with shock, but with something deeper. "Oh, you saved me," he said hoarsely. Emily swallowed hard, lowering the Colt. "No, we saved each other." For a long moment they stood there, the barn smoldering, Clara's frightened sobs drifting from the doorway, and the night sky stretched endless above. In the ashes of ruin, something stronger than fear began to take root. The crickets sang, and the air was warm with the smell of fresh earth and wood smoke. Clara curled up between them, her head on Emily's lap, her small hand resting in James's. For a while no one spoke. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full, steady, alive. James looked out toward the fields, the charred skeleton of the old shed just visible in the fading light. "Tomorrow I'll start rebuilding," he said. Emily glanced at him. "You don't have to carry it all alone." He turned to her, the corners of his mouth lifting in the smallest, truest smile. "I know. Not anymore." Clara stirred sleepily, whispering without opening her eyes, "We're safe now, Papa." James brushed a strand of hair from her face and looked at Emily with a tenderness that no storm, no fire, no grief could burn away. "We are," he said quietly. The prairie stretched endless before them, scarred yet beautiful. Behind them the house stood, still simple, still small, but no longer empty. Within its walls lived laughter, memory, promise. And on that porch, beneath the wide and watchful sky, 3 broken souls finally became whole. Years later, the ranch bore little resemblance to the scarred land it had once been. Where blackened beams had fallen, new timber barns now stood strong. The fields stretched green and golden with wheat. Cattle grazed contentedly along the fences James and Emily had mended together, and laughter often carried across the yard like birdsong. Clara had grown taller, her hair long and braided, her stride confident. She helped her father mend harnesses, carried baskets of eggs from the coop, and asked questions about everything. But in the quiet evenings, she still sat with Emily, learning stitches, stories, and the quiet kind of wisdom that could not be taught by books. Emily had become the heart of the house. The townsfolk no longer whispered her name with pity or suspicion. Now they greeted her first at market, asked her advice about remedies, praised her bread at socials. More than once, Mrs. Elkins had leaned close during quilting circles and said, "You saved that man, dear, and maybe all of us too." Emily only smiled, though her eyes always strayed toward James whenever someone spoke of saving. James himself changed in ways he never expected. The weight he carried after losing his wife and brother did not vanish, but it shifted, became something lighter when shared. He was still a man of few words, but those words were different now. Softer. Sure. He found himself laughing more often, sometimes so hard Clara would laugh just to hear it. One autumn evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the sky to fire, James came in from the fields and found Emily standing on the porch. Her hands rested on her middle, a quiet secret in her eyes. She looked at him the way she had on the day she walked down the church aisle, full of courage, trembling with hope. "James," she said softly, "we're going to have another." For a long moment he could not speak. He only reached for her, pulling her close as the wind rustled the tall grass. Behind them, Clara's voice rang out from the yard, chasing a puppy they'd taken in weeks before, and James realized this was not just survival anymore. It was not merely keeping the land from falling apart. This was a life, a future, a family being built on ashes and faith. The ranch that had once stood as a monument to loss now hummed with new beginnings. And in the twilight glow, with Emily's hand in his and Clara's laughter filling the air, James Langley knew he had found what he thought he had buried forever home. Then hold it close, the way you would a letter kept in your pocket through miles of dust and years of waiting. Stories like these aren't just about the West, they're about us. About how love can stumble, fall, and still rise stronger than the wind. So let it remind you, no heart is too broken, no past too heavy, no dream too far. Out here on the edge of the frontier, second chances are the truest kind of gold. If you'd like to ride along for more, subscribe to Legend of Love Stories, where every tale is a fire lit against the dark, a reminder that even in the loneliest places, love finds its way home. Because sometimes the bravest thing we do is choose to love again. Subscribe to Legend of Love Stories for weekly tales of forbidden romance and frontier courage, where bullets missed but hearts didn't, where love defied the land and the odds. Hit subscribe, like, and share to keep these stories riding strong. Until next time, partner, ride true and love wild. Clara had grown taller, her hair long and braided, her stride confident. She helped her father mend harnesses, carried baskets of eggs from the coop, and asked questions about everything. But in the quiet evenings, she still sat with Emily, learning stitches, stories, and the quiet kind of wisdom that could not be taught by books. Emily had become the heart of the house. The townsfolk no longer whispered her name with pity or suspicion. Now they greeted her first at market, asked her advice about remedies, praised her bread at socials. More than once, Mrs. Elkins had leaned close during quilting circles and said, "You saved that man, dear, and maybe all of us too." Emily only smiled, though her eyes always strayed toward James whenever someone spoke of saving. James himself changed in ways he never expected. The weight he carried after losing his wife and brother did not vanish, but it shifted, became something lighter when shared. He was still a man of few words, but those words were different now. Softer. Sure. He found himself laughing more often, sometimes so hard Clara would laugh just to hear it. One autumn evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the sky to fire, James came in from the fields and found Emily standing on the porch. Her hands rested on her middle, a quiet secret in her eyes. She looked at him the way she had on the day she walked down the church aisle, full of courage, trembling with hope. "James," she said softly, "we're going to have another." For a long moment he could not speak. He only reached for her, pulling her close as the wind rustled the tall grass. Behind them, Clara's voice rang out from the yard, chasing a puppy they'd taken in weeks before, and James realized this was not just survival anymore. It was not merely keeping the land from falling apart. This was a life, a future, a family being built on ashes and faith. The ranch that had once stood as a monument to loss now hummed with new beginnings. And in the twilight glow, with Emily's hand in his and Clara's laughter filling the air, James Langley knew he had found what he thought he had buried forever home. Then hold it close, the way you would a letter kept in your pocket through miles of dust and years of waiting. Stories like these aren't just about the West, they're about us. About how love can stumble, fall, and still rise stronger than the wind. So let it remind you, no heart is too broken, no past too heavy, no dream too far. Out here on the edge of the frontier, second chances are the truest kind of gold. If you'd like to ride along for more, subscribe to Legend of Love Stories, where every tale is a fire lit against the dark, a reminder that even in the loneliest places, love finds its way home. Because sometimes the bravest thing we do is choose to love again. Subscribe to Legend of Love Stories for weekly tales of forbidden romance and frontier courage, where bullets missed but hearts didn't, where love defied the land and the odds. Hit subscribe, like, and share to keep these stories riding strong. Until next time, partner, ride true and love wild.